All right, everybody, welcome to another episode of the Destreza lecture series. My name is Puck Curtis, and I'm here with my co-host and fellow fencing master Eric Myers, and we are with Sacramento Sword School. And tonight we have Ash Bermudez. Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah, pretty good.
Okay, why don't you say it?
Bermudez.
There we go. I love that. And he discovered the SCA and Northern Shaolin Kung Fu at the same time. And he's had a lifelong affair with the martial arts ever since then. He's been fighting in SCA heavy combat for 22 years, and he specializes in spears, pole arms, and two-handed swords. He's competed in SCA Rapier for about 17 years, exclusively using Destreza, La Verdadera Destreza. He's had a lot of success in applying Destreza theory to the use of longsword, spear, Dussack, and other weapons. Most recently, he's coached a number of Buhurt teams, or Buhurt, in Western Canada before dedicating himself for the last several years to the development of an unarmed curriculum for self-defense, which is also based on his understanding of the true Spanish school and drawn from HEMA traditions. He's successfully coached and continues to consult for boxers, mixed martial artists, Buhurt competitors, and FCA fighters, and he's taught self-defense, arrest tactics, and use of forces for security and law enforcement. And I think what's particularly interesting about his approach is that we talked, I think, in the last couple of sessions about bringing modern ideas to the tradition and what lies in the next steps for the tradition. So here we have last week we had Dario using Destreza tools to look at 133. Here we've got some original work using the tradition to look at unarmed fighting. It's a really exciting opportunity to see where it can go. So Ash, thank you so much for joining us and presenting your work, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you for having me. I'm going to click through the next couple of slides quickly here. I just wanted to have a little fun with it. So obviously I had to give the thing a ponderous title. That was one of the prime requisites for having a piece of work in this tradition. So I think most of us here speak or understand Spanish to some degree, but I'll translate here. That what I have here is a meditation on the universal philosophy of arms of Jerónimo Carranza and his disciples, with a scientific method for combat with the free hand or open hand, for self-defense and defense of others. I've been lucky to have gotten to write this presentation living on the west bank of the Shilish Nation in the Okanagan, which is just one of the most beautiful places to be if you guys ever get to visit. And let me kick this off, assuming I can get to the top of my screen without triggering that. There we go. All right. So the traditionally mandated hype session, as Puck said, I did discover Shaolin Kung Fu via Sifu Marquis Lung, who was my school counselor actually, and I grew up in a relatively rough neighborhood in Vancouver, and I was getting in a lot of fights, and there was a lot of gang activity, and I was looking for a way to not be part of that, and Sifu took me aside one day after I'd been sent to his office for the umpteenth time, and he said, like, do you want to take some martial arts? And I reminded him what my address was and told him that I couldn't afford any martial arts. And he said, well, I wasn't asking if you could afford them, I was asking if you wanted to take them. Which got me into Northern Shaolin Kung Fu. And at the same time, while I was going to the Boys and Girls Club in Burnaby, I discovered the SCA via archery. And Buddy was telling me, because he'd brought in a 6-foot yew longbow, I was talking to him about that. And then he started explaining what the SCA is, and I'm like, whoa, back up. I get to sword fight? Like, that's a thing I can do for fun every weekend? So I was hooked pretty much right out the gate. In 1998, you could still be 16 years old, and as long as your parents had seen one practice, so they could sign off on a piece of paper that said that you were allowed to get clubbed like a harp seal. So I started doing heavy combat right away. And again, it was an addiction. When I graduated from using Sword and Shield, because that's one of the, in the SCA, one of the few pedagogical traditions I've found is that everybody starts off with Sword and Shield. The argument usually being, use this so you know how to fight against it because everybody else is going to be using it. But as soon as I could get away from Sword and Shield, I started playing with Longsword, Greatsword, Spear, and Polearm, Halberds, Axes. And right around that time, the knight I was studying with, he was a big fan of circular footwork and had, as much as we could say that someone in 2000 who was not a specialist in fencing or in historical fencing, he did try to encourage me to look for LVD specifically, saying that the offline footwork was something that had inspired sort of what he was doing. I was lucky enough to have Ken be in the same city as I was, and so I had someone who was a talented fencer who I could riff off of and get information from on LVD. At the time, I wasn't specializing in LVD for the sake of Rapier. I was really trying to get better with a spear. And I felt that LVD had a lot to offer in that sense, with essentially seeing a spear as a very long rapier, right? I'm primarily a point weapon. Establishing atajos is not all that different. The offline footwork, being able to strike a chord across the circle that we're familiar with, all of that bled really easily and well into spear work. And I was able to come up with sort of a short list of techniques and tactics that I've used to some success. As part of this adventure of looking for more martial arts to play with, I ended up falling into WMA. Of course, at the time, the only books I could find were Clement's book. David Savet at the Academy of European Medieval Martial Arts had put out a book called The Art of Longsword Combat, Volume 1, which was heavily Fiore influenced. Clements was largely German influenced, as were a lot of the different groups in Calgary, which actually, Calgary, Alberta, by the way, has a phenomenal number, and always has, certainly for the last 20 some odd years, of reenactment and HEMA-based theatrical groups. It's actually quite an interesting place to be if you like HEMA, a surprisingly large population. So yeah, I got to play with Longsword, Dussack, Polearm, because that's what everybody else was playing with. I did both Bloss and Harness Vectin because I wanted to be a well-rounded medieval warrior. 2004, I actually found the Arma version of the Jeu de la Hache and the notes that they have up on there, which I started playing with and having a lot of fun with. Obviously, not all the plays are applicable to the SCA because there are rules, but it was a lot of fun. And over time, I started to see in all of these systems, I started to see a lot of close analogs of what everybody was trying to achieve. And I started to see that they kind of all bled and related back to each other. In 2007, I started working in security and executive protection. And what I did was I started to take every training opportunity I could through the companies I was working for. So I got to play with a lot of arrest and control tactics, lockup, PPCT, Blauer's spear system was a lot of fun, and these guys from Ontario running a thing called Ranger Systems, defensive tactics. Most of these are either geared towards or designed by folks who are ex-mil or in law enforcement, and they have a lot of heritage from the World War II combatives world, because a lot of that fed into the way that martial arts programs in the US and Canadian militaries are designed. In fact, there are HEMA elements now in the close quarter combat manuals for MCMAP, which is the Marine Corps martial arts program, as well as the Modern Army Combatives program in the States, and the Canadian Forces Close Combat Manual, all of which share certainly consultants, if not some of the authors, but they all draw, in part at least, from this military tradition from the World War II combative side. And again, you start to see the similarities between the ways that people in battlefield scenarios and in battlefield context use martial arts. And seeing battlefield jiu-jitsu techniques, seeing modern arrest and control tactics, seeing Fiore, and getting to play with all of them side by side and concurrently really did open my eyes a lot to the way in which we could see some universal aspects of martial arts. And of course, having a brain at least partially filled with Destreza propaganda, I started to look for those similarities and see what I could what I could glean from them. In 2013, I went to the National Chivalry Combat Federation, which was a thing I started because I wanted to get hit harder. A bunch of friends and I wanted to actually push for Canada to have a truly representative Buhurt team. So we needed more representation from the Western provinces. So we got a couple of teams up and running. One of the funny things that happened there was when I got the first demo going with my friends from Lethbridge, they were experienced combatants. I was an experienced combatant, and we were hoping to attract more experienced combatants. We had a thing at the Battle of Brooks, at the Brooks Medieval Fair, and it was supposed to be a demonstration to try and attract some of the other presenters, because, as I said, Alberta has a lot of reenactors and a lot of HEMA groups. That's not what happened. I ended up with a large group of neon green noobs, lovely people, but none of them had ever held a weapon. And so I suddenly was an instructor instead of just like, hey guys, you want to come over and hit me? And I had to come up with a curriculum fast. So I started everybody on polearm. I went to Jeu de la Hache because I felt it provided a lot of options at multiple ranges. And I really started enjoying that, but right around this time, there were I had to start pulling away from Buhurt right after the first couple of tournaments we did, the first couple of years. There was a lot of stuff going on politically in Alberta that I was getting involved in, and it started to steal my attention. In 2014, I went to my first Paddy Crane conference and workshop, which was actually life-changing. The Paddy Crane, for anybody that doesn't know, happens every 2 years until recently in Banff. I don't know where they're going in the future and what's going to happen after COVID. We're missing one this year. But while I was there, I got to talk with and interact with Jared Kirby. I got to talk to the Martinezes at one point. I got to play with and chat with Roberto Martinez Loyo of Elite Fencing down in Mexico City. And most importantly, from a pedagogical point of view for me, I got to talk with a man named John Lennox, who I actually think should get an invite to do a talk. He's not LVD per se, but his attempts to come up with a unified combat theory actually line up really well with a lot of the ideas that LVD presents, and I think he comes up with a way to summarize some of the theories and ideas in a really interesting way. It's I say that his combat theory is LVD that doesn't know it's LVD. As also in 2014, I started the development of this self-defense system for vulnerable demographics. So as a result of some of that political upheaval that was going on in Alberta, I was approached by some folks who did not feel comfortable in most martial arts or gym settings, saying that they were actually fairly frightened and would like to learn how to defend themselves. And I had to tear apart what I had learned so far, because it's a different context when you're trying to take control of somebody to arrest them than it is if you're just trying to defend yourself from an assault. And so at first I'd started and started coming up with something that was actually fairly aggressive. Again, going back to that Krav, get tough, sort of killer, get killed style of self-defense, which was what I had most experience with in the self-defense world. And I realized that that's perhaps not the approach that I would want to take. And I wanted to do something that was more scalable. I wanted to do something that was a little bit more concerned with keeping people personally safe, as well as being able to ensure the safety of everyone around them, including their opponents. So that's where this program comes in, and I hope it's enjoyable for all of you. This is another one of the traditional pages. This is where I would normally talk a bunch of shit about everyone. Ooh, there we go. Now here I have a little tongue-in-cheek thing where I say, everything that works about German and Italian Destrezas is what is consistent with the findings of our philosophy. Everything that sucks about them is what is particular to them. And I have a thing about atajo, as you probably a bunch of you know. And I do believe that it is sort of the thing we're looking for in the fight at all times. I agree. I believe that German and Italian fencing both make use of the concept of atajo in different ways, and it's when you start adding extraneous and unnecessary movements that we start to get to the point where things become more about athleticism than skill, and that's where it starts to break down. So that's my shit talk. Oh, and F Pacheco, no, not him, the other one. So if everyone wants to grab a drink. I couldn't get a priest to vouch for me if I wanted to, so we will have to do this without the knowledge of the Inquisition. So I wanted to start with the 4 causes to get into what I did. So my final cause is the same as it was in Pacheco's time, right? I want the preservation of one's own life and safety and the life and safety of others, including to the fullest extent possible one's opponent. The efficient causes of the persons involved are so many and varied. As I say here, skill, motivation, knowledge, emotional and mental state, social, cultural factors, stressors, and triggers. And I'll touch on this later, a large component of what goes into the totality of circumstances in a fight has to do with the mental processes of the people who are engaging in the contact. That it's important to look at those when trying to design. Hold on a second. There we go. When trying to design something that people can actually deploy out the gate, having an understanding of mental processes and of the way that psychology, especially in combat, works is important and vital. Our motivations also change. Our legal and social and political constraints have changed somewhat drastically since Carranza was writing, and that's something to take into account as well, right? We're not worried so much about matters of honor here. The contact that we're having in an assaultive situation is not going to be something where we can necessarily pick a medio before entering into combat range. In self-defense, usually the first blow has already been struck. And that's something to take into account, is that we're not coming in from a position of safety. We're not coming in at range trying to establish a atajo or a virtual atajo from outside. Most of the time, we're already in the fight by the time it breaks out. So that was something to take into account. The material causes, the bodies of the opponents haven't changed much, thankfully. We're still anatomically modern Homo sapiens. Weapons, armor, and terrain. Terrain hasn't changed much. I mean, there's more concrete, less cobblestone, but moving from place to place, I feel, is not something that's drastically altered. weapons, again, here I'm going to be talking about using the human body as a weapon predominantly, which drastically changes the geometry of a fight to something where there's a piece of steel that's 3 feet long sticking out of the end of one person or the other. Armor has changed. It's not a factor in this particular demonstration or in this particular presentation because I'm doing unarmed combat here. But obviously, the things that we wear, the safety equipment or whatever, is an issue. And we are seeing armor being used in violence on the streets these days, unfortunately. As well as sword and shield, actually, which is one of the things to relate to this. We're seeing quite a few HEMA-related groups, I'm going to say, represented in a lot of the upheaval that, for example, the United States has been experiencing recently, and some of the footage from abroad has also shown individuals who obviously have either Buhurt, SCA, or HEMA backgrounds engaged in acts of violence on all sides. So there are some similarities and some crossovers that must be examined in the modern era, and that leads me to the formal cause of what's going on here, which is the geometry and practice of the system, right, or the Destreza. And my goal was as follows.
Oh, wait, I had a question for you.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Pertaining to the previous slide. So I like that you pulled out the 4 causes. It's a very Destreza way of doing things. I think we should probably all try to follow that example if we can. But I'm curious about this because we're getting ready to jump into unarmed fighting with grappling and punching and kicking, maybe biting.
Definitely biting.
So these 4 causes, it seems to me that like final cause and formal cause are both identical to what we would use sword in hand. And then perhaps efficient material cause have changed. So the question is, if final and formal causes are the same, can we make an argument that this is part of the Destreza tradition, even though we're covering what we think is new ground tonight?
I certainly hope so. The formal causes actually do end up changing a reasonable amount, and I'll get into that. I was very much looking at using Destreza as a lens for the selection of technique and for as a reasoning process to get through sort of the catalog of stuff that we can choose from in order to build something and try to come to something that's cohesive. So this is where some of this comes in, right? So this was sort of my functioning guide was, whereas the historical European martial arts tradition encompass a vast array of effective and armed and unarmed techniques for a variety of contexts, which I feel is a postulate that I can make fairly easily without too much argument. And whereas La Verdadera Destreza, as envisioned by its foundational treatises, purports to be a universal scientific language for the analysis of armed combat geometry. And whereas the combat geometry of any melee weapon is governed by its relationship to and acts as a continuation or extension of the geometry and physics that govern the human body, therefore it should be possible to construct a scalable and adaptable system of unarmed combat for modern contexts that includes striking and grappling using the analytical lens and language of LVD and drawing on the extant source materials of the HEMA traditions. So this is the project I set myself. You can actually see some of the SCA influence in here in the sense that the idea of drawing on the extant source materials of the HEMA traditions is definitely that sort of arts and sciences competition drive of like, I'm going to try and make this as period as possible. So trying to keep it within the confines, trying to keep my sources for the most part to within the confines of what we consider the scope of the foundational treatises. So I try not to have too much stuff that's going to go past about the 1850s kind of thing. Like and so then I can document everything that I have as having existed at or before the time of the foundational treatises. So in trying to come up with this, I had to try and address a number of issues. And one of the biggest ones in any combative situation is that there's just a lot of signal and noise concern in a fight, especially for new fighters who have trouble differentiating between the two. And I think of this as chaos, like mathematical chaos. Any situation complex enough to disallow for the easy and accurate prediction of the outcome. So if there's too much going on, if there are too many possible variables, we start to run into some issues. There's this Degrees of Freedom article here that I've posted is actually by Sean Franklin, and it does a really good job of summarizing something called the Degrees of Freedom problem, which is that one of the issues that we have in fighting is, as a vertebrate creature, never mind a Homo sapien, we actually have an innumerable number of ways of arriving at the same spot with anything that we do. As Ernesto had mentioned in his lecture, there's a constellation of martial arts out there specifically because humans can and do move in so many ways. But that's a problem because it makes the prediction of where those bodies are going to meet, where they're going to interact, how they're going to respond. All of those things are extremely difficult to predict. And that's the core problem, I feel, of most martial arts, is trying to figure out how to create a suite of techniques that will cover all of these possibilities of threat. There's also situational complexity, or the totality of circumstances, and I touched on that a little bit earlier during my causes. But we've got issues of terrain, issues of rain, issues of reach, issues of size, issues of gender, issues of motivation. There are so many different factors that feed into the totality of circumstances in an assaultive situation that it can create an incredible amount of noise for the person who's dealing with it on the receiving end. On the giving end of violence, we've got the problem of Hick's law. Again, as Ernesto had said, right? We've got that spoiled for choice issue of, well, I'm a generalist and I've got 10,000 different techniques that I could draw upon, but that means I've got to sift through a Rolodex of 10,000 techniques to pick the right one in the moment. And that creates an issue. And then we've got our internal chaos, which is our stress responses, right? In an adrenal situation, we're going to have auditory exclusion. We're going to have tunnel vision starting to experience. We're going to lose fine motor function. Heart rate's going to accelerate. Our breathing's going to get ragged. There's a whole host of physical factors that come into play which don't help us at all in the nuanced analysis of what's happening in the assaultive situation. So these are some of the factors that I had to deal with right out the gate of how am I going to address these, and how do they affect the end result of coming up with that final cause, of coming up with that system, and that formal cause of coming up with the right geometry to be able to address an assault. I do a lot of reading on military history and tactics, and can certainly encourage that as well. And I came up with the idea of trying to apply command and control functions to different aspects of Destreza, right? So when I say command and control, what I mean is, as you see here, a set of organizational and technical attributes and processes is important, that employs human, physical, and information resources to solve problems and accomplish missions. And then below it, I included something which is important for me to remind myself, is because I am such an Atajo fanboy, and I am such a fanboy for the style, that all models are wrong, but some models are useful. And that is to say, I can create all these organizational, technical attributes and processes, or I can steal them. Either one works. But I need to remember at all times that they are simply models, and that there are going to be holes that you can drive a truck through if you're not careful. And it's then my job to try and find those holes and break them up. I break command and control into two separate sections as well, and that's Command being the rapid and adaptive acquisition, prioritization, interpretation, and lucid reaction to incoming data, which operates on a cognitive process which can be usefully modeled as a decision cycle. And then control is simply the capacity to perform the necessary actions required to achieve one's intent and reliably determine the outcome of a situation. These are separate but very carefully interrelated functions, which I believe feed really well into some of the stuff that we've talked about in the past about Carranza's loop, which I'll be getting to in a second. We're at this point mostly familiar. It's come up a couple times in the previous lectures with Boyd's OODA loop. So this was a cognitive process model that was created by one of the guys who changed air warfare as well as command and control warfare through the application of this specific model. And it was intended as a way of giving pilots not only a model to fall back on if they found themselves in that mental chaos, right? You could suddenly like, okay, no, I need to observe, I need to orient, I need to decide, and I need to act. It is a simplification of neural process, but it also provides a little bit of information on how to break down someone's neural processes in a fight, and that's something that we'll touch on in a bit, and it's really cool. It was revolutionary at the time, or it seemed that way, though Carranza had him beat by a couple hundred years, as revolutionary as the OODA loop was. But there have been other models created since then, certainly, which are perhaps more fluid. So the Canadian National Use of Force framework is actually one of my favorite ones to show, because most modern military use of force models, which, as I say here, they're sort of supposed to help you engage in a constant cycle of assessment and reassessment, so that you can make sure that everybody is safe, right? And respond to threats in an efficient and proportionate manner, as I say here. The problem with a lot of the mental models that they build is they're actually literally a ladder. So when I say that they escalate real fast, I mean that absolutely. And they tend to work on a 1+ model. So if you go to 10, right, then I'm going to bring the use of force to 11 in an effort to control you, and it doesn't permit for a lot of de-escalation. It's actually one of the reasons why I ended up rejecting using that hyper-aggressive Fiore Krav version that I had running in my head early on in the development of this process, was that collapsing a guy's trachea doesn't really permit for a lot of de-escalation. So instead, I wanted something that was a little bit more nuanced, and in a throwback to what Matt had said about Frias's escalation of force, which I think is in keeping with what Carranza had hoped for the system, is this idea of I can preempt and de-escalate, I can defend until opponent withdraws, I can disarm, or I can wound or kill if unavoidable. And you see that here in the National Use of Force framework. You have the ability at any point to call back and come back to a softer form of contact. This is not designed to be a continuum. It is designed as a mental model for a thought process, which is another thing I thought was really cool, because it kind of fits in with where the way I see Carranza's loop, which is that KPDA, right? What I know, what I perceive, what I decide, and how I act. And I make a big claim over here that says the Diestro's job is to simply perceive the current state of the system, decide which response to apply from a limited repository of empirically proven tactics, and act. The knowledge that makes this possible is the training and development that precedes the encounter, which I'll be referring to quite a bit as schema or schemata. And that is part of motor development and neurological processes, which schema model is a model that is used in neurosciences and psychology as a decent model for the way that the human brain processes, stores, and catalogs information. and the use of schemata, which I'll explain a little bit in a bit, is one of the ways that I feel that martial arts best exemplify the use of psychology for the development of motor function. This was something which I wanted to add in there, which we'll deal with, is how then to interrupt this this loop in my opponent, and where. And I can come back to this, but I wanted to break ACT down into a convenient little abbreviation. I forget the word. But more to the point, what I wanted to do was come up with a graphical representation of something that Carranza and Pacheco will be familiar with, which is this idea that movements are easy to stop in their beginning. But at the beginning of the actual executive movement is where you want to stop it. I like the idea of stopping it as the executive is coming in with the commitment of mass already begun. And the reason for that is I don't want people to be able to withdraw. I want to stop them once they have made their decision, once they're in the process of acting, so that they have to recalibrate after their attack fails. And that's part of this, which is the idea of cognitive warfare, which this quote came to me, came back to my mind when we were talking at VisPuck. And that is this idea that what I want to do is I want to funnel as much chaos and as much noise and as much uncertainty towards my opponent as possible in the fight. And this really speaks to me as so that his decisions are irrelevant at the time of execution. I want him to always be one step behind. That was one of the things that I felt was actually kind of integral to the style. And I wanted to include it here because it is functionally what is necessary, especially to keep a smaller person safe against a larger person. I feel you have to be able to steal time. And I like this. This is ooh, ooh, ooh is the sound of a broken OODA loop. And what that means, this is David Ullman, who's one of the guys who is friends with Boyd, discussing the idea that if you are successful in disrupting your opponent's decision cycle, he is constantly observing and reorienting. He's never actually going to make a clear and successful decision if you are just creating noise for him every single time he tries to make a choice. How would I go about achieving this? Well, as I said, I'm an Atajo fanboy. So this goes back to the way that I've my engagement with Destreza, in that Rapier was not my focus for most of my years playing with Destreza. Rapier was a study tool for me. So I was trying to glean, even earlier, even before this self-defense program, I was trying to glean ideas from the Destreza manuals about how I could use any weapon. I wanted to know what those universal underpinnings were supposed to be. And I found that the dialogues in most of the manuals actually did a better job for me than the technical side readings, which focused so heavily on the sword alone. I really liked seeing the conversations take place frankly. I could imagine them very easily as taking place between, you know, Squire and Knight, or Cadet and White Scarf. And what I really liked about them was that you got to see differences of opinion leaking through in the dialogues, right? Who says that, oh, well, Atajo is the universal, right? It's like, okay, well, what could you possibly mean by that? And one of the things that I came coming back to was there almost seemed to be two concurrent and coexisting definitions of the process that Atajo, not the physical traits of an Atajo, right? Everybody said the same thing. I mean, like the Real Academia says it, right? And that's, you know, you're gonna put your blade over the opponent's, cut off its angle to you, right? Greater degrees of force. the technical aspects were one thing, but what were you trying to achieve was sort of where I was going. And I like this. This is from Comprensiones de la Vega, and it's part of the diálogo. And it's any wound that you execute on your opponent while denying them the chance to wound you, even if they are willing to be wounded. The diestro de nas de maestro, y cómo se forma el atajo, right? Well, atajo is formed when the opponent's sword is cut. They say cut in such a way that no disposition to be wounded is provided unless they remove their sword and take the long way around, which I thought was a really good description of what I was going for, and what I kept seeing as being the functional process of atajo, that I could then apply to different systems. The Real Academia, of course, sort of repeats, as I said, a lot of this, poniendo la espada sobre la del contrario, cortándola. So fencing, put the sword over the opponent's, cutting it. At the time, it looked weird. I was like, okay, are you cutting through the sword? Are you trying to cut across it? You look at cortar, and right away in definition 9 for cutting, you see atajar as the first piece of explanation, right? And that's atajar, detener, entorpecer, o impedir el curso o el paso de las cosas. To stop, halt, hinder, or impede the course of passage of things. That to me is interdiction. What I am trying to do is provide a barrier to the continued advancement of an object. This is the other definition that I find, or that I read into the dialogues. And so here we have the diestro saying essentially, is there like this one way that we can set ourselves up that will make it so that absolutely nobody can ever hurt us, right? And that's including, weapons of unequal length, especially if one has a, longer weapon such as an estoc, spear, or pike. And the maestro says no, but the science teaches us to pick a measure and to govern our body and our sword so as to provide the least possible opening. It's not possible to protect the whole of the body with the line of the sword, but it is possible to have fewer, smaller, and thus quicker movements to make than one's opponent. And I really, really like that as well. The idea that if I am controlling the center of the fight, then I'm forcing an opponent to then take more movements, right? Okay, well, we're going to first they're going to have to move offline. Either they're going to have to make a desplazamiento with a compás, or they're going to have to make a disposition with their blade. Something has to change in the system for them to have a trajectory to me. And that was more in keeping with my understanding at the time of atajo, because as a modern Spanish speaker, my use of atajo is the shortcut. So that made more sense to me than the atajo as impediment definition, which may be more popular elsewhere, but in Nicaraguan Spanish, as being taught by my grandmother, atajo means shortcut. But I actually think that both of these definitions work together. And maybe that's because I do have a background in military history, and that my approach is, okay, if I want to control space, then the best way to do that is from the center. I actually had a little drawing that I was going to try and show that I never ended up finishing, but it shows a passage sort of around a mountain, a path just leading around. And if you're the guy sitting on that mountain, and I mean, this is why castles were placed where they were. If you're the guy sitting on that mountain and you control from above that road in 3 directions, you can get anywhere on that road faster than somebody traveling traveling down the road can. And that means that you can perform interdiction. You can stop them from advancing. If they go back, you can actually provide interdiction on the other path, and you can get there faster than they can going around. And this would have been a context that I feel the authors of the foundational treatises would have been familiar with. It would have been baked into their understanding of the word atajo prior to its use in verdadera destreza. When we adopt a word for a new process, or when we take a word and apply it to a new idea, we can't really divorce that word from its previous meanings and from the way that people are going to hear it. And I think that having that atajo defined variously as it would have been linguistically is part of what makes up the definition in the minds of the people using it. And as you see here are a bunch of the definitions of atajo, atajar, and their various conjugations and uses, right? So I can cut an enemy off. I can find a shortcut. I can end a fight or argument in a decisive manner. I really like this, cutting a herd, because that's actually part of how I envision footwork. Traveling overland, or going the hard way. Scouting, and even leaving by the back door, or taking off down the alley, right? Echar por el atajo. I see a lot of relationship spatially in what's going on here with all of these various definitions. And that comes to where I see atajo as an algorithmic control of space. And what I mean by that is, if I'm trying to reduce complexity, then the function of being able to say, okay, I provided interdiction along this line, which means I no longer have to worry about that line. If something is going to change in this system, they first have to do one of 2 or 3 predictable things in order to re-engage. And that gives me the ability to pay attention to the field where I'm open and to looking for a target without having to concern myself with all this extraneous stuff that's going on elsewhere. So it's kind of a pseudo-mathematical function. I say pseudo because I'm actually a crap math student, but I like drawing circles and squares. So I'm a geometry kid, and that comes from being an artist. But I do understand the idea of I need to eliminate entire fields of noise and unnecessary data. Which kind of brings me to the right angle, and I know that that I've brought this up in the discussions previously, is that I like the right angle not only for the maximization of offensive reach and defensive distance. I like it because it takes up the middle of my grid. Moving into the right angle prior to stepping into a virtual atajo, it lets me respond to threats on any line faster than hanging out in one extreme or the other, I guess would. And that means that I have less work to do to defend myself. I think that the algorithm functions on this concept of privación or denial, which is, that común, particular o absoluta. Privación común, when we're at the right angle, is either one of us is going to have to make, right? Yeah, exactly. Medio, right? One of us is going to have to make a movement. And that's true, particularly with the designs of swords that we use. And for this, I'm going to assume roughly equal height, roughly equal reach, 2 guys using cup hilts. The weapon that we use in the cup hilt specifically is designed so that when we are held in the right angle, somebody has to make a dispositive movement either of the body or of the hand before they're going to be able to reach anybody. Particular, right? Privación particular is one partner or one opponent has the atajo. The other opponent is the one that's going to have to go around. And then privación absoluta, which I've heard in reference, or I've read in reference to the state of things at the conclusion, is I absolutely have left you no recourse with your weapon, and you're about to lose it, obviously. But there's this idea that as long as you're behind your steel, as long as you're behind safety, your opponent's weapon, for example, is pointed outside of your defensive planes, and will have to re-engage from a different trajectory. I can work, you can't. You have to readdress yourself before you can work. I can go to work now. And this is where a lot of John Lennox or Doc's combat theory that he does with his company Art of Combat comes in. And the way that he worded, and I really, really liked it because it really does cover to me what atajo means, is cover the line, control the weapon, control time. As long as I know where your weapon is, so I've controlled it, I know which direction it's headed in and it's not towards my body, so I've covered the line, I can strike you, ideally, or I should be looking to be able to strike you, at my leisure. And if I am striking you, I am now going to force you to react to that strike rather than come up with a plan. And that's where we start to get back to that diagram I have of the act and where to disrupt it, is this idea of I want to control time. I want every single one of my actions to get to you or to where I need it to be to ensure my safety faster than you can get there. And if I'm waiting for you to be at just that moment of commitment, where that is definitely the tack you're taking, I know for a fact where you're going to be. I know for a fact what line I have to close, and I can then start making decisions for the next turn while you're still reacting to what just happened. How do we get there? Well, modern psychology and modern kinesiology and kinesthetics has a lot of different ideas about how we program those command and control functions. And there's a lot of stuff that goes into play. So when we're talking about perception, we have both the external and internal ways of perceiving. We have our eyes, ears, our classical five senses. But we also have an internal sense called proprioception, which is the knowledge of where and how you are oriented in space. And that actually you get from neurological feedback. There are nerves in your muscles that are giving you positional, postural, and load information for each muscle group constantly, and that's helping you to determine where you are, what you are, how you are oriented, and what you are in the process of doing, or what is in the process of being done to you. And this relates to this other idea of a body schema. So there's that schema word again, which is an adaptive postural model. So in your brain, you can imagine how you look right now, right? If you focus on the way you're sitting, if you focus on your position in space, you can draw in your mind a fairly reasonable sketch of how you are positioned presently. And that is your body schema. It is your ability to make an intelligible model of how you exist in space, how you are moving presently. And that body schema is important because it does things like help you calculate reach. It helps you calculate the velocity with which you can close a line. It helps you imagine what positions will put you out of balance. Folks who have not been able to develop their body schema to that point, that's what clumsiness is you have not developed a schema for this particular action that is ingrained enough in your brain to be able to be useful for this use. Long practice fixes that. Building motor schemata. So these are the movement schemas. These are the schemas of I want to adopt this position. And actually, this is one of the things I like about German fencing is, as one friend of mine described German longsword, is whoever adopts a guard first wins. And what you're doing when you're drilling these transitions from guards to other guards and to cuts is you're developing motor schemas. You're saying, okay, if I see an opening there, what does my body need to do in order to be able to land an effective and powerful cut to this position? and we want to build that as an instinctive model for movement. Mental chronometry plays a role, and this is we get into a lot of stuff here. Tacto plays a role in the sense that, and somebody had shared an article, which I'm going to try and find the link to again, discussing exactly how much faster Saman de Fer, that tactile neurological response is than waiting for the visual response, right? Your body will read something that it is touching much faster than your eye can perceive it. And that helps you to have a faster KPDA cycle than your opponent. The Simon effect is an interesting one in that movements done on the same side of the body as the stimulus that you're responding to will be faster. And that'll come into play in determining guards and how we establish a defense. Informational chunking is another way of speeding up reaction time. Chunking meaning literally just to take what could be a vast field of information and reducing it to chunks that are digestible, so you only have to access, you know, to use a bit of a metaphor here, like if your brain's a filing cabinet, you only have to pull out one file rather than sift through the whole drawer. Cognitive schemata, this is more of a developmental tool, and I think that there's a degree to which, and I can get into this later during the questions, but I think that the heritage of thought in the Renaissance leads to the use of a lot of cognitive schemata, and a lot of these graphical representations that we see in our style share a heritage with the computational and logic models of like Ramon Lull and Giordano Bruno and Leibniz and a lot of these other Renaissance and early modern thinkers who were steeped in the ideas around scholasticism and around the way that thought and logic developed in the early classical and then later medieval and Renaissance periods, and a lot of it ends up looking like Destreza, diagrams, because they love the circle, they love the sacred geometry, I guess is what we would hear a lot of hippies call it today, but it's this idea that there are answers to be found in the structure of things, and they had this idealized structure, but they would also use these schemata and these diagrams as ways of encoding in their minds entire sections of biblical knowledge or entire reams of religious and spiritual argumentation. And it was all just encoded in these simple squares, couple of letters here, a couple of lines, and then this is how you built memory in a time period when, you know, carrying the sum of all human knowledge in your back pocket was not a thing. You know, you could sit down and you could say, okay, well, we're going to have a discussion about this thing that I know about, and you could draw a circle and then start picking through the different arguments and going through the different things because you've created a mental schemata. Another aspect of mental chronometry is what I'm going to refer to as tactical parsimony, and that's I want to have as few choices as possible, right? That relates back to Hicks' law. I want one choice to be able to yield to me a number of given results rather than try to come up with 1,000 different ways of achieving a single end. And then I have to try and turn all of this information into something that can be taught or learned or drilled, and that's motor skill development. So I have to start looking at closed skill learning, drills, reglas, even partner drills, versus open skills, which is what you have to access in the actual system of a fight. It's going to be more complex. There's going to be lots of stuff to change the way that things are happening, right? We know as diestros that we can practice in a circle. We can get all Thibaut on it and draw out a perfectly proportioned to us circle on the ground, and we can know exactly where we're going to stand for each medio proporcionado and exactly how long each of our steps should be. And then we're going to get into a place where I can't actually go in a particular direction, or I have to draw my step 6 inches shorter. So we have to be able to adapt those mental schemata and those positional schemata. We have to be able to adapt them on the fly, and that's what open skill learning is, as opposed to closed skill learning, which is when you're performing a predictable and repeatable skill process in a controlled environment with very few outside variables. Which leads me to building command and control via varied practice and play. There is one massive advantage to the way that the SCA runs its pedagogy that is throwing you to the wolves. And it is both a blessing and a curse, and that is it will absolutely reward you for bad practice. But if you want situational awareness, having 500 people doing their level best to shoot you in the head and rush at you, and having to listen for orders while you're in the process of defending a bridge, you will start to see fights as a game. At least that was my experience. And I find that it also gave me the ability to play with and against everybody's different types of weapons, everybody's different types of reach, right? I mean, you're in the SCA, you can be using sword and shield, and the guy across you might be using a giant rubber fish on the end of a 20-foot stick. There's just, you run into some, pardon my French, but you run into some weird shit. And it's nice because it forces you to adapt. It forces you to try and test your theories and your technique against things that you would never encounter in the wild. So I really like that, and it helps. I find it helps to build that open skill side of things, as long as it is paired with good closed skill learning, because that's where the SCA falls down, is closed skill learning pedagogy. So now into the meat of things. That was my theory component, I guess, on how I was going to try and get this done. So part of it was I'm going to start to look at do the assumptions of Destreza about the human body bear out, and in what ways do the material and the material efficient causes change the formal cause of the geometry. So here we have a depiction of a lot of different boxing and pugilism guards dating back through the ages. Everything, I mean, the Greeks were practicing pankration and pygmachia very early on, and we have not so much technical accounts of how things were done, though we do have some surviving descriptions of how several bouts were won, or and accounts of different fights from the Olympiads. But we have actually a reasonable amount of artistic representation of both pankration and pygmachia in classical art, and we can see there's a plethora of different ways in which you can stand in preparation for an unarmed fight. I've got a couple of defenses here illustrated as well, but first we're going to deal with balances and guards. So here we have this chap who is leaning back a fair ways, traditional pugilist's stance, very familiar. And what we have is a refused head, which is left uncovered. We have a fairly long guard that covers the body. And we have him with the majority of his weight on the back leg. So this is a fairly offensive stance, I'm going to say, in the sense that most of his preparation is to be able to explode forward. he can defend himself using that reach and controlling the center through the use of straight punches, such as the jab and the cross. And a lot of pugilists vastly preferred the use of the straight punch over round punches. Because they were considered a more scientific way of boxing, they were more defensive. You had to pick your shots rather than just swing for the fences. So all very much in keeping with a lot of what we discussed in Destreza. At the other end of the balance spectrum, we have a guy like Daniel Mendoza, and Daniel Mendoza over here is he was a Sephardic boxer living in Britain, who was a very small guy for the time to be the champ, and this is before weight classes were really a thing. And he actually preferred a forward balanced, very aggressive stance. You see him here; he actually squares his shoulders up a fair bit. And he defends his entire line with the forearms, and then tries to close aggressively. And he discusses this at great length in his Art of Modern Boxing manual. In between, there's sort of this plethora of ways that you can stand. I ended up opting for a very neutrally balanced stance, and again, part of this was the causes that I was working with. I had a variety of bodies of individuals who were asking for this class, and not everybody was athletic, and so I needed something where folks could be stable on their feet and still be able to. He did, yeah. Mendoza wrote a book, The Art of Modern Boxing, and so I wanted that stable stance, very neutral to the body, nothing that was going to put anybody in an extreme, really. So I tuck my chin because modern boxers headhunt even when they're not wearing gloves, which is ill-advised, but it's a habit that they've got baked in. So a lot of striking happens to the head, even in physical altercations and assaults nowadays, rather than to the body. So I moved my guard up a little bit, which, yes, did open up my belly, but I refused the belly through footwork and through the use of forearms, very similar to the way that Mendoza does, and I'll get into that in a bit. Another thing that we see, though, is also this control of space using the hands. And what I wanted to illustrate by having this guy down here with who's pulling his hands back into this elbow stance to block a straight, and then this guy over here on the right-hand side who's fully covered up, he's fully shelled. This idea that I can stop attacks at a variety of ranges as they're coming into me, and being able to use those degrees of freedom, which were a problem earlier, in an algorithmic way to say, okay, well, you've gotten past this point of my defense. What is my next option? Well, I can collapse to this guard. I can go to this guard, and that's what I found really fascinating about the way that Matt describes Frias's system, is that there is that allowance for a steadily collapsing set of guards to deal with different situations and different threats. La línea del cuerpo, I mean, they still exist. I didn't draw the lines in real perspective here, but they have the potential to still be useful, and I'll show why. It would have been really easy to just drop the lines over the boxer and say, okay, well, cool, they're still there, and then move on. But I actually did want to make them somewhat useful. And it turns out that, okay, you know what? Most of my targets are going to line up along one of the lines or another. I forgot to label the liver, actually, over here, which is weird because I love punching people in the liver. but most of my targets will have a line. So depending on how I'm standing oriented against an opponent, or depending on how my opponent is oriented standing against me, there are going to be different things they're going to be able to reach, and I need to be able to say, okay, I need what line do I need to be able to shut down most effectively at any given point. Right, and as you see, I've got everything from the instep up. One of the wonderful things about HEMA is the ability to, without without too much trouble, include something like purring in a system, which is raking the shin or kicking the shin. It's a good old-fashioned HEMA tradition, but it's definitely something to remember, is that now we're dealing with full body targets, and we're dealing with multiple deployable weapons on the human body. So there's lots of different stuff to use, and there's lots of complexity. Did I do this? Do they still make sense? I feel they do. The division of the three horizontal planes is useful, and I'll explain why when I get to defense. The rear and front is useful as well, and I didn't finish the graphic for this, but I had Mendoza and that backward leaning boxer. I can't remember what manual I stole him out of. Placed along here, and blown up roughly to scale, you can see the difference in what is being offered as a target, what is well behind the defenses of either opponent, and how they close their line, right? Mendoza, ducking down and hollowing out his body the way he does, he actually offers his face, but there is very little avenue to get to it. You're more or less only making contact with the top of his head because of the way that he's holding his fists out in front of him like this. And because he's got that hollowed out body, there's not a lot of space to get to his belly either, right? Whereas the other guy, the hands are down here covering that belly, and the head is very far removed. So the math changes of how I need to be able to get in there and how I need to be able to lay hands on this if I'm going to deal with it, or vice versa, how somebody's going to address me. So being able to say that, is it a balanced forward stance? Is it a balanced backward stance? Is it a balanced neutral stance? Is it a balance, is he balanced to the inside? Is he balanced to the outside? Is he holding himself in the high line, or is he more occupying the low and mid line? All of these are useful because they give me different calculations and different variables to play with, but it also means that I can ignore certain stuff, right? So if Buddy hollows himself out and I don't have a clear shot of the body, I know I need to come around and try to open that up and try to get to short ribs and try to get to the kidneys and that sort of thing. And I know that if he's weighted forward and to the inside, that I have the ability to come out here, and he's going to have to change his weight before he can respond accurately to me. So this is still a useful model, and I really like that I can still employ it. So the body hasn't changed much in the last 500 years. That's really cool. That makes me happy. It means I have less work to do. How is the footwork going to look? So this is one of my older pictures of what my circle looks like, and I was pretty happy when I was done creating it that it actually bore some semblance to some more familiar circles. We got Pacheco here on the left, we got Rada on the right, again, it would have been really easy to just say, okay, well, neat, I can put two guys in a pair of circles and imagine a circle between them, but is that really useful? And the círculos menores I find particularly useful because we still have to deal with our matters of medio de proporción, of reach. Each of these concentric circles is a particular medio proporcionado, which I'll talk about in a bit. So the círculos menores are still a useful model. The círculo común or círculo mayor, I'm less and less in love with for unarmed combat, and part of the reason is at this distance, at this range, almost every move you're making, instead of being properly a round move, is going to be some species of transversal with a slight pivot. It's just the way that things are going to work at this range, because that change in aspecto that you're going to make will leave you both equally vulnerable if you don't almost immediately close your line and establish a new diámetro particular. So I don't use circular footwork per se. I use small facets around the circle at best, but it is straight footwork. Líneas infinitas, la línea del diámetro y las líneas transversales, they are still, hi cat. They are still something that I can use, that I can make use of, because movement is still going to take place largely along these lines. Oh yeah, sorry. The diámetro particular would be the diameter you establish when you have moved off of the common diameter shared between the two fighters, and then be able to re-engage. So what use are those lines to me? Well, I like the lines because you take them with you, and they help you to determine which way you're facing, and they help you to determine a couple of things. So I have the círculo propio y sus líneas. The circle whose circumference is imagined as being defined by the points of balance in the fighter's feet. Should be wide enough that the bulk of the fighter's mass never overhangs it. So we say, like, I want shoulder width apart. Okay, but if your fighter is quite heavy, shoulder width might not be the way to go. Their shoulders may not be the determining factor of where the bulk of their mass sits. So we have to be able to adjust a little bit for causes, and I just want you to be balanced. I want you to be able to make discrete movements. I want you to be able to make the rotational movements, which I'll explain later, majitas, and to be able to execute any of these techniques without overhanging your balance, and that includes the techniques where you're bringing up a leg, where you're interfering with a low line using your knee, that sort of thing. So as I say here, the center of balance should remain over the círculo propio, not overhang it. The lines. So here I did get into a little bit of a conceit in that I specify these líneas paradiamétricas and the línea infinita central. So the paradiamétricas are going to be the two lines occupied by those centers of balance of the feet, and they run parallel to the diameter, which is why they're called paradiametric. I won't be using this a lot except to discuss rotational changes in the body as we move around this sort of star pattern that I have drawn out here, which I'll explain in a bit. And the línea infinita central, I only include a name for because rather than occupying the infinite lines from the points of balance, it's the one that sits right under your center. So it can be imagined. It's as Matt sort of says about the lines of infinity. It's a bit of a throwaway, but for me it simplifies things because I can just, that is the línea infinita as I depict it. That is the diameter as I depict it. These are the transversales as I depict them. Everything just runs through the center for me rather than working off the feet. The feet change a lot. So those concentric circles around the círculo propio are what I refer to as medios de contacto. And what I wanted to do was break up the techniques that I was going to select in discrete chunks that I could then train proprioceptively. The diameter being normally where the toe points is, we have a very bladed stance, right? So that diameter runs straight through the center, in theory, of the fighter, right? We'll have our lead foot up here. we'll have a back foot set up at the 90, and then the diameter runs through us into the opponent. With a more balanced bit of footwork, this foot is rarely going to be positioned in such a way that it and my center are in line towards the opponent. So these medios de contacto are they're very important to me because of the way I end up drilling and structuring the design of the way I start chunking the techniques. Each one of these is defined by the maximum reach or of a specific medio proporcionado of a lead hand attack. So the outermost is a push kick distance, and the second one is my lead straight or a jab. Third one is what happens when I raise my knee to 90 degrees. And the fourth one is what happens when I raise my my elbow to 90 degrees. The reason that I use these distances is because they are techniques that I can apply along the center line to stop an incursion. And they are also good indexing distances. So I can train myself to be aware of what I can do at each of those distances, and each of those distances provides me an absolute measure that is proportionate to my body, from which to then train the proprioceptive elements of the skill development. This is one of those shitty sketches I warned you all about. This is where those lines sit on the floor as compared to what's happening with the body. So there's my push kick, there's the jab, there's the knee, there's the elbow. The fifth range is once everybody gets in, is now we're cuddling, and that's we're dealing with the grappling range at that point. We're dealing with throws. That's when you start to get into sprawl and brawl kind of tactics. Which I'm going to touch less on the grappling in this presentation, by the way, because including both striking and grappling would have been ponderous. But I got to work with combat hugs, exactly, struggle snuggle, but this is just a representation of what I was envisioning when I said, okay, well, I know that these tactics are all things that I can document. B, they provide that maximal reach offensively and defensively that I'm looking for at each of the stages where they can be engaged, and they do provide me an elective medio that I can say, okay, well, I know what I can do at this distance. The steps are, I mean, they're pretty familiar. Like I said, originally I had included some circular footwork in this pattern, but ultimately I found that it was just very difficult to justify purely curved steps when really I'm just occupying a slightly different angle using a transverse step. So I have my paso recto, or my compás recto. I have my transversal steps that extend into what would be the círculo común. And then there's, I really want to get into seeing what Rada's final hexagonal pattern is all about. I look at that thing and it makes my eyes bleed, but I get the feeling that I would love it once I understood it. I have my pasos laterales o de trepidación. I have a movimiento extraño. I've elected to call them mixed movements esquivos because of their function. And I think that there's a degree to which the argument could be made that technically transversals are also mixed by the definition. So yeah, esquivo means to evade, and that's what this is. It's an evasive step that I use specifically when someone wants to claim the center. I can have a ready surprise waiting for them. This is not to scale, but this is an example of how these feet would be positioned at each of the lateral steps, the accidental step, or the extraño step. So at the end of each, I should be back in my original guard. The footwork is very familiar to anyone who's done any boxing. It is a slope step. The slope step bears a lot in common with Destreza footwork in that it is intended to maintain balance, not cross your feet. It should be able to provide the ability to react quickly and adaptively to different stressors from different angles. So here what I have is just a little simple diagram for the straight steps, and it is, depending on the direction you're headed, you go red foot first, blue foot second. So I'm going to go forward, then my lead foot's going to go first, followed by the rear foot. I'm going to go backwards, back foot, then rear foot, left foot, then right foot, right foot, then left foot. Right? So pretty straightforward. And I take my lines with me. And that's important because of what's something that's going to come up in a little bit. The transverse steps are a little bit trickier in this, especially with that without the sword there to sort of provide cover. So what I have here is I'll cover the center line with my right arm, and that is a movimiento remiso and extraño. I'm sucking in my elbow and pulling it across my body. As I turn, I take a transverse step with the left foot, and then I drag the right foot in a circle behind me. Let's see if I can move that. There we go. Transversal to the right, same thing. I'm going to cover my center line with my left arm as I take my my diametric line and turn it sideways. I'm going to take a transversal step with the right foot, and then I'm going to pivot as I drag the left foot. Those esquivos, same thing. I got to cover up. Both of them are executed right foot first. So I will drag that right foot over, and then I will shuffle very quickly back into this guarded posture at the bottom left. And then same thing on the right hand side. The right foot goes out straight, and then the left foot gets pulled in. And in all of these movements, I'm covering that common diameter between my opponent and I as I go to readdress. This is why I take my lines with me. These are my hitas. Things are happening in a very, very tight circle in an unarmed altercation. And so the ability to readdress across a wide segment of my positional compass is important because stuff changes. So all of these movements can be done with very little displacement of the body, and while keeping the movements economic and without having to rely on too much athleticism, right? I can go from having a control, a sphere of control essentially that goes from E to B to suddenly from A to D to C to H with very little work. So I can go 180 degrees, give or take, with almost no movement. It requires no athleticism. It just lets me readdress my entire defensive line should I need to. So I have described hitas here as an axial change in aspecto performed over the center without changing the location of the círculo propio on the inferior plane. Because it needed to be an over-the-top and overly elaborate Spanish style explanation. So here I show you some of the cambios in aspecto, right? So these are those transverse steps that I showed you once the pivot has been effected. If I need to get around to access somebody's targets, I can use my forward steps, defend it, and actually open up new directions. If somebody crashes my center, if they really, really want this space, then having that ability to have a very simple evasive maneuver that takes me offline and puts me on their outside again, so that I can go to work is really nice. And it provides a lot of targeting opportunities while maintaining my defense. So here are aspectos and how they relate to the lines of the body. Depending on where I'm standing in relation to a person, or depending on where they're standing in relation to me, really does determine what targets are viable to them. Facing from the front, obviously, as soon as somebody steps off of that common diameter, they're going to have access to everything up my center line. And they're also going to have access to that, that forward collateral, which is going to possess ribs, spleen, all sorts of things that you might want to get to. This guy over here, sitting on my side, he has access to short ribs. If he throws a hook, he can get to my kidneys. This guy here has access to kidneys, has access to spine. He can kick out the back of my knee. This guy here's got my spine. He's got my neck. He's got the back of my head, my occipital. He can kick out either one of my knees. So these changes in aspecto break a person down into a limited number of targets and a limited number of threats. They can no longer bring all 8 or 9 of their weapons, head, fists, elbows, knees. They can't bring that to bear over here. They can bring that leg to bear, and they can bring that hand to bear, but until they change their position, they can only bring so many weapons to bear. And it also limits the number of targets that I have. I'm not going to go for a liver punch if I'm sitting on this side of somebody. So far, what I'm at this point in the development, I was like, okay, well, it does seem that I can actually use LVD to describe what's going on in a fist fight. And it is providing me with already implicit ways of how to break up the positional training and the positional and learn the motor skills necessary in order to be able to turn this into an effective system. Right here we have some of that footwork and how it relates to not only changing the angle at which I'm facing somebody, but also showing the changes in what weapon ranges I have available to me, right? So here's those medios de contacto again. I take that transverse step to the left, and I go from not quite being able to reach my opponent, right? From medio de proporción, that's the end of my long kick there. I take a slight step to the transverse left, and suddenly my jab and my thrust kick can both reach. That means that I can reach with a cross. That means I can reach with the rear kick. That means I can stuff his legs if he's going around for a kick. So I have a number of techniques now that I'll get into the final list a little bit later. But I have a number of techniques I know I can use based on his distance from me, which I know empirically because I know that I can now reach him with a T, right, or with a thrust kick. Same thing happens on the right-hand side. I've now got different weapons lined up against different targets. But again, I've got a discrete number of weapons that I can use because I have a discrete number of techniques at each range, and I've got a discrete number of targets that I can focus on. This is another aspect of footwork which I think flows really well into Destreza, in which Destreza has a vocabulary to be able to define. And I call this atajar el camino or atajo por terreno, and it bleeds into that idea that I have of atajo being a sort of universal thing that can be used. It can be used in footwork. When cutting the herd, and I actually got to play with this a bit because right around the time that I realized that cutting the herd was one of the things you could use as a definition for atajo, I was actually working on a sheep farm, and having to wrangle sheep is an exercise I feel in Destreza footwork, in the sense that I need to be able to occupy a medio. If I move too far to one side, the sheep are just going to circle around and get behind you. You're not going to be able to split them up properly. You're not going to be able to get them going in the direction you want. You're trying to create pressure in a certain direction using your footwork, that gets them to think it is in their best interest to go in the direction that you're hoping. And what that requires is that you stay far enough back and nimble enough in your lateral movement to be able to deny entire ranges of the terrain to the animals in terms of their calculation of, can this predator reach me? It's very similar to cutting off a ring in boxing. In boxing, when you're engaging, if you want to really put somebody on the ropes or into the corner, this is how you're doing it. And the squares, actually, these are not mine in the sense that I didn't imagine these squares in the boxing ring. These are depictions that boxers still use to this day of how to cut off a ring. It looks very familiar, no? You can get into extremely segmented versions of this that almost start to look like Thibaut. But what it's really trying to say is that there are lines I can adopt and walk along that will control entire sections of this ring. And if I can get my opponent to the point where I'm the one shepherding, I take the center, and there's that conception of a tajo of mine that if I can have the center, then I can get anywhere faster. Then all I need to do is actually, rather than close in aggressively and have him circle around me, right? So I don't want to get into too much of an extremo, right? I want to maintain my medio. I can beat him to any part of this ring where he might be able to get around me. And when I look at something like this, and when I look at something like, for example, Thibaut, where the footwork, where every one of those intersections is another place from which I can determine the number of lines to adopt, depending on what the relationship is between myself and the opponent's weapons and the footwork that we present each other with. It all does start to bleed together fairly solidly. I've definitely used some version of Destreza footwork to disrupt someone's thought process in a boxing ring before, and it's been a lot of fun. So all of that is just to get us around on the ground, though. What is the actual meat of the system? What techniques did I choose, and how do I defend against them, and does that line up with Destreza? So I wanted a discrete list of techniques. This is relatively short for unarmed techniques. I had a lot of fun stuff to choose from, even just limiting myself to the HEMA tradition like I did. There is a lot of there are a lot of techniques. Again, stretching back from Brancati all the way through to Mendoza, and even some of the early Savat manuals. Like there are a lot of choices. So I kept the kicks simple, largely because there are two kicks which appear throughout the entirety of HEMA history. And that is the push kick and what Savat players would call the shazba. I do get into some side kick and kind of like that mule kick, hook kick stuff later on, but when I started teaching this as a self-defense system primarily, I really did just keep it to the push kick and the shazba. Because those are two that I can use to either create distance and allow for a person to circle and get out of a situation, and to create distance, for example, against an unarmed opponent. An armed opponent, without getting too much of their meat involved in the fight. And then the shazba, because it can be used to disrupt an opponent's base or disrupt their attack. And the shazba is a low kick. I'll show you some pictures in a little bit. Hand strikes. I actually teach this when I'm doing self-defense alone. I teach only the hammer fist, chops, palm heel strikes, and cascachos, which is I'll make contact with that portion of the hand, like on different soft targets. That's what I do when I teach self-defense. Now, because I've been sort of test driving this using gloved hands at the University of Calgary's sparring club when it was still operational before COVID, and in my boxing forays, I do use the jab, cross, hooks, and uppercuts, but but not for self-defense. I prefer to teach non-closed fist strikes for self-defense reasons. That said, the hand strikes that are not related to boxing are related to weapon attacks for the sake of parsimony. Again, I want to be able to say, okay, cool, so you did that. Now here's a weapon in your hand. Do the same thing. Chops and hammer fists follow the same lines as tajo and medio tajo. Honestly, depending on the way that your hand is displaced, depending on the relationship between body parts, I can use it to come around hard and fast off of somebody's defense or somebody's deflection. I mean, you can also drive them into most soft targets, and they'll have quite a solid impact. Palm heel strikes are great. They create a lot of distance. So that jab, for example, you can deliver a palm heel strike to the top of the head. It'll snap a guy's head back pretty solidly, which creates a great moment into which to strike. And it also creates distance. Again, I like using the long straights to try and circle and get out of the situation, right? You're not gonna, in a self-defense scenario, you're not looking to win a fist fight. You're looking to get the hell out of there or end it decisively. So kicks and punches are really, or hand strikes are really designed to create opportunities and to for either escape or for conclusion. Knees, there are two really that I teach for self-defense, and that's really just the thrusting and the rising. The difference between them being sort of where the disposition leads to. The thrusting knee is if I bring my knee up defensively to control space because I feel that somebody is incurring into performing an incursion into my space, the knee comes up. I can then direct that forward via movimiento accidental of the knee, and I can do them some damage and disservice. The rising knee is, I mean, that's pretty self-explanatory. You aim that for the apex, and you can stop a conversation real fast. Elbows, thrust, again, you can use that to control space. You can use it to create a pain response and force a dispositive action from your opponent. Rising elbows connect with chins real good. Horizontal elbows are actually fun. The only place I've found a very clear depiction of horizontal elbows is Pasha. Has a super clear shot of somebody delivering a beautiful horizontal elbow that I find fascinating, and I kind of wish he'd actually included a little bit more striking in his manual. And then descending elbows, which I'm actually I worry about less. I feel if you're in a position where you can drop a descending elbow on someone's head, you can probably get leverage and overpower them and deal with them that way. Same thing with the descending knee. I have a fairly nasty knee attack that I had originally included in the system, and then decided to pull it out because it's a cigar cutter to the occipital, and so I figured that was probably not something that was necessary. If you have somebody that bent over, you can probably do something a little less aggressive. So where do I find the justification for these techniques in the sources? Well, I mean, again, I've got a great deal of Greek statuary, Greek and Roman statuary art, vases, and we've got kicks appearing in several of the manuals. The lead side is shown less often in manuals. I find that there's plenty of room for rear foot kicks, but they're usually delivered when the weapons are bound up or when things are occurring on the higher plane with the hands, and so it's less of a ranging kick. the rear side straight kick, and more of a punitive, more of a damaging kick. This lead side push kick, which forms the medio proporcionado of my círculo menor, the first medio proporcionado, the first medio de contacto of my círculo menor. It serves the purpose I want, which is to create range, and to keep an opponent away and to deny them the diameter. Straight light lead, or straight lead again. Plenty of sources. Here's that palm heel strike to the top of the head for ranging and for distancing. Now that can be delivered either as like just a straight arm to stop somebody from coming in, or what in boxing we would call a stop. Or also can be used as a leverage block. If you fire it across the line of an opponent's attack, you can really rob them of their juice, and that can actually bleed into some of the grappling techniques and some of the winding and spiraling actions, very general like actions that sort of imply themselves later. I tend to use this as a counter punch rather than initiating. Again, in a self-defense context, if somebody is going to take a shot at me, what I want to be able to do is suck the power out of that shot and keep them at bay, keep them from getting to my body, and keep them from being able to bring more weapons to bear. So I counter punch with my jab quite a bit. It'll also obstruct entries. So if somebody's really trying to get in close, as I said, I can create distance. And it also provides indexing range and preparation for second and third intention blows, right? This is acometimiento or necesitar. I can force openings, I can force reactions, and I can do so from a relative safety. The lead knee is seen here used in a couple of different ways. Obviously, as I said, there's that rise right into the apex that we're all sort of familiar with. But there's also this use of the knee as what appears to be a ranging tool, right? To deny somebody that entry. And what I like about the Greek sources is that we're dealing with individuals who were explicitly using multimodal attack formats, right? These were strikers who could also grapple, who were allowed to do everything except, what, gouge an eye out and bite. Was that the? So so we see actually this distance maintaining knee a fair bit, which I like. Again, I use that just to shut down the line that it exists on, right? If somebody's going to try and kick me, I can get this into my center line and closing the door on their attack faster than they can get to me in most cases, as long as I can read their dispositive. Lead elbow, here we see it used defensively. In fact, most of what we see it used is defensively. Individuals will shut down in the depictions, will shut down lines of attack, or seem to be shutting down lines of attack, and possibly preparing for things like hammer blows and chops, which can then be used from the dispositive that is created implicitly by the defense. So those are my 4 lead hand medios de contacto, and sort of how I've justified them. Rear side strikes, there's a plethora of them, right? Here we have that lead side thrust kick. We've got that shazba, which I like, being used here to disrupt knees, to take away people's bases, to stop their advance. We have the lead side straights and hooks. We've got that right hand being used. We've got the lead knee, or sorry, the rear knee being used as somebody transitions forward in their mask. And we have Pasha's horizontal elbow, which just makes me stupidly happy. So this is how I look for things. I'm looking for art and for descriptions and plays that are consistent with the way I envision certain techniques, and then I can look at them side by side and say, okay, well, is this something that looks like it's being delivered the same way? Read the passages and the glosses that come with, and determine whether or not I'm reading what I'm reading. And if it is both useful tactically, fits in with what I'm envisioning for the system, and provides the kind of parsimony that I want, then it gets in. Which leads us to how do you defend from all that jazz? So here we have Mendoza at the bottom saying, you always parry the blows of your adversary's left hand with your right and those of his right hand with your left. This is consistent with that Simon effect I was talking about, where if something is happening on the right hand side of your body, your right hand will be able to respond to it faster than your left hand. It's also spatially makes more sense. You can't you cannot get your left hand to the right hand side of your body as fast as your right hand, which is already there. So sort of going from my understanding of De la Vega's comprensión as well, and his line in the dialogue about the or his section in the dialogue about the lines, where he says, the cup defends the high line, the strong defends the middle line, and the weak pulling up the attack to your forte for inclusion is what defends the low line. I go hands defend the head, forearms and elbows defend the body, knees and feet defend the legs. Anything coming in on the low line, I shut down using those lead knees or the shazba. If there's a dispositive movement that looks like it's going to be a kick on the low line, then somebody's going to catch a thrust kick right around the navel. The forearms and elbows, I can do those collapsing ordered guards where I have from here I can pull up into that position where my forearm is vertical, and I can pull all the way up to that wing guard that we see the Bankratist in that on that vase doing, where he full on parries like this, right? Which honestly, I mean, it looks like a flinch response, but it still applies the same idea of I'm going to shut down that center line decisively and offer up a threat to the offending weapon that's coming in. So if somebody's going to hit me, well, they're going to punch me in the elbow, and that's going to be a bad day for them. And then the defense of the head, I leave to the hands, and it's literally the wing block goes up to defend hooks, and I use simple displacements into the center to pull straights across my body, which then actually leads to cambios de atajo, or not cambios de atajo, transfers of atajo, very similar to what we do with daggers and bucklers when we take control of the opposing weapon using the sword, and then transfer our atajo to the secondary weapon in order to free up the blade. So that's all still in play. The defensive planes are still a useful model as well. I want to make sure wherever possible that the opponent's weapons, the energy of the weapon, the vector of the weapon is directed outward from the defensive planes rather than into them, right? Especially especially because there are so many weapons that can be brought to bear. I don't want to be dealing with an attack that's actually coming online along one line, because that has a potential to create then a distraction, which will allow other weapons to be brought to bear. So I always want to be mixing my footwork with the desvios and with the handwork to try and make sure that I am creating a situation of atajo, and where I'm limiting the number of weapons, performing a limiting action, I guess is what Sean Franklin would say in that Degrees of Freedom article. Performing a limiting action on the number of degrees of freedom that my opponent can bring to bear, which again I think is fairly consistent with the idea of atajo. And spiraling actions. So closing those lines is the beginning of the thing, but there are a great many times I find when that initial contact lends itself to engaging in something that starts to look a little bit like generals. And what I mean by that is when I stop an attack with a hand, depending on how snappy my opponent is at pulling that hand back, if I've still got contact, if I've still got ductile on him, then I can stay with that hand and follow it around, which allows me then to stuff the next attack, or to use that hand even to put him at a disadvantage of aspecto, and allow him to obstruct his own use of his other weapons. These spirals also come into play once we get into grappling. Fiore, a lot of the grappling actions that attack the arm in Fiore can be applied starting from a spiraling action made on contact. So if somebody's made contact with my hand and I've managed to follow around with them, I can get my arm around their arm and put them out of position. They're now sideways to me. All their weapons are offline except for the one leg behind this arm I've got bound up. I can settle backwards a little bit, pull their weight onto that arm, and now I shop the candy store and pick a target at my leisure. Same thing over the top. If I follow them around this way, I can step into that line as long as I keep that hand, their free hand, impeded. I can follow that straight line into their body and leverage their elbow over here, and I can drive down. It's I can't remember what Fiore calls that particular move, but essentially I create a leverage block with my entire body and then bring the elbow down, and you can have some pretty exciting times making somebody's joints pop that way. So again, the geometry of the human body and the geometry of the sword all seem to really play together, and that relates again to that body schema concept that I spoke about earlier, in that there's actually in neurophysiology there's a bit of a debate about to what extent the body schema can include tools to which you are accustomed, right? To what extent those tools become an extension of your body in your neural positional model for yourself. And I find that yeah, no, there's a fairly consistent set of motions and ideas that can be applied, because at the end of the day, those degrees of force in the sword, as we've seen in the demonstrations in the foundational treatises, they don't end at the hilt. Right? The same ideas follow down all the way down the arm. This is, I know that I can bring more power to bear from my shoulder than I can at the hand, right? Here we have a picture from one of the Fiore glosses, right? And Buddy's got a hand on. So what's Fiore doing? Well, he's creating a tight circle with the shoulder, and so he's applying greater degrees of the arm to a weaker spot, and that is how he's affecting his escape here. So all of these movements are all natural to what we've been doing in LVD, but they appear here not only in the rest of the HEMA traditions. He takes it up to 14 up the arm, right? So it's all here. I think that, for my money, the implication that the weapons are simply extensions of a human body. The human body is an object in space, and as an object in space, it is governed by some on the face of it simple geometry that can provide a useful model for simplifying the chaos of combat. And this chaos here is my drilling system. So as much as I'd like to say something cool like, well, I spent a year in solitude contemplating the geometry of the fight, what really happened is I was living in Milk River, running sheep there, as I was saying, and it is a town with 800 people, and I had a lot of time on my hands, so I would spend 3-4 hours standing in a door jam, trying to figure out how to best use that to train myself into not only using primarily this suite of tactics that I put together, but how to parse that into something that was going to be tactically useful. The advantages of using a door jam. One, damn near everybody's got one, and if not, you can find one. So using a section of wall or whatever, as long as I'm provided with a number of strike surfaces that are flat and relatively perpendicular to each other, I can do a lot of what I'm hoping to do. I will then envision to a degree a compass on the ground, which will provide me different vectors from which to address these targets. I can then engage those targets from every angle on the compass and from every one of my contact ranges. And I will build the drills so that I am just walking around the compass at first at each of the ranges. So I'll start at my first medio de contacto, and I will see, you know, where I can reach each of these or whatever targets are presented to me by my position on the compass with my lead hand, with my attacks that are available to me at that range. When I get to the other end, I can move in a step to the point where I can reach with my jab and still be balanced, and then I'm going to go back through the compass. And then I'm going to move in a step, and I'm going to make contact with my knee, and then I'm going to move back, and I'm going to work around the compass, move in with the elbow, move around, and then eventually I get to the point where I'm cuddled right up to the door jam, and this starts to train me in what my clearances are. How can I escape from a tight position? What is the minimum amount of space I need to be able to put my elbow into somebody? Right? So what I'm doing is I'm building these motor schema based on the combination of my target selection, range, and how I'm addressed to it. And that helps me break down specific, it helps me build open skills in a closed skill building format, because now what I do is I can perform these actions, and I'll explain a couple of the drills that I do. They all have that same format in terms of the walking around the compass and working at different ranges, but I'm working different things with each of the drills, and I'll get into that in a second. But what this allows me to do is create discrete chunks of information for when I'm targeting in a fight. And then later it can become a very free flow exercise where I am striking from every angle, from every range, fluidly in a single exercise. And something that Matt had said about his study of Thibaut and Thibaut's spinning is some of those spinning techniques and some of the ideas of what happens when things don't go exactly right. Right, when you put your foot down slightly the wrong way and you start to say, okay, well, this has changed my balance significantly enough that I need to readdress my body. What is the most natural way to do this safely? You can start to work on stuff like that as well using a drill like this. So I call one of my drills La Pistolera. My girlfriend's dad, he was teaching a lot of quick draw competitors, and one of the things that she taught me about the quick draw game is start pointed and in good posture. Like start with your weapon out, drawn, pointed at the target, and in good posture, and then holster, and then start pointed properly, holster, start pointed properly, holster. So rather than creating any dispositive actions in the motor skill that I'm developing, I'm training myself to simply, I'm training the posture itself as a natural extension of what happens. And because I'm not thinking about like, get the gun out and point it, it's actually, it's a bit of a brain hack in the sense that you start to build that proprioception of knowing how to get from one to the other and back very, very quickly. So what I do is I will place myself in position, and jab's a really good example. I'll place myself in a position for a solid jab. How do I know it's a solid jab? Well, I'm not unbalanced if I pull my hand away from the wall, but when I'm placing my hand there, I can definitely tell that there's a bit of a load. So I know that my mass is committed, but not overcommitted to the point where if I suddenly pull my hand away from the wall, I'm going to fall forward. So I get into a good posture. I make sure I'm balanced. I make sure that that's where I want to be, and then I will just work that for a couple of hours. Just start from the jab, come back to guard. Start from the jab, come back to guard. It trains me to cover myself again really fast. It trains me to come back to that guard natively, but it also eliminates the dispositive movements of the punch as I'm training it. So yeah, I do this for all strikes in the viable at this combination of medio and aspecto, right? Then I move to another medio, repeat it all medios in all viable aspectos. Another drill that I will do is this idea of el afirmado, which is I want to get into either medio 3 or 4, deliver all viable strikes in combination accurately and with power, right? So this is there are other drills to play here, but these 3 are sort of some of the core ones that work on the positional stuff that I want to get into. And then I force myself to retreat to a new medio while covering myself with the ángulo recto jab or push kick. I want to make contact, and then I want to see about following that line of force, following that force vector out. And what that helps me to do is it helps me to train myself into getting behind my point, as it were, making sure that I am readdressing along the line that I have just created, so that I'm at my optimum offensive reach and optimum defensive distance behind that strike. So I'm almost pushing off of the wall with the strike when I'm done landing all the rest of them. And I try to make it as natural as possible, where I'll finish a phrase of strikes, and then the next opportunity I get to deliver the medio de contacto treta, the ranging treta, I then force myself to get behind that force vector as I deliver it, and that gives me a great deal of proprioception to be able to pull back in a fight, and makes me fairly elusive and evasive. Another fun bit that I got into especially with that quick draw training, was that I can generate a phenomenal amount of power with no dispositive. And what's his name? Jack Dempsey, in his boxing book, which is a little bit out of the period for me, but he has this very awkward, I feel, metaphor about getting a baby dropped on you from a height. He starts off with this description of, like, well, a baby only weighs so many pounds, but man, if I drop him on you from 3 floors up, it's going to mess you up. And I think that's a little bit awkward. For me, what I was trying to think is, okay, from what height would I be comfortable with a 175-pound anvil being dropped on me point first? The answer is none. So what I wanted to do was see if I could leverage natural movement to generate a great deal of striking power in as short a distance as possible, without using muscle, without using as little muscle as possible, and using only my gravitational acceleration or rotational acceleration. The idea is pretty common for us. I mean, there's a degree to which that's what a lunge is, right? Where we don't have to push off quite that much if we know how to extend our body once the blade is in play. So you extend your arm, you then extend your base, and the extension of your base both accelerates and provides force to the point, which then drives through the opponent. Dempsey does his Dempsey drop, which is very similar to this that I'm doing here. So I guess there's the inconsistency in my original idea of keeping everything within the scope of the foundational treatises. But I didn't think Carranza would hold it against me because I was using natural movement. So Dempsey drop is simply, I'm going to take a short step forward as I deliver the jab. And what that's going to do is that rather than providing a strictly pawing or ranging jab, it's going to actually add my entire mass to that jab. And it's a really stiff jab. And I really like that. But I took it to the next extreme and started saying, okay, well, if that's the case, then all I really need to do is extend my base. Now, if my points of balance are the ball of this lead foot, because I've just done this forward falling step, and sort of the outside front of this right foot. If I just kick that heel out, like just turn it so that the toe is now pointed along that paradiametric line again, and my weight is now on that heel, I've actually extended my base by about 4 inches. And it turns out that 4 inches is a hell of a distance to get a 175-pound anvil dropped on you from. So I've been able to combine that speed of delivery and lack of dispositive that is provided by the quick draw drill with this idea of extending my base the minimum amount that I can or that I need to in order to be able to impart some mass into what is now a very quick strike. And the end result is that I can put out a punch every, like fraction of a second that is sitting at about 60 or 70% of my full power. So I'm not delivering necessarily full knockout power with every punch, but every single punch is one that you have to cover or you're going to take damage. And that to me is very useful because that's how I steal time. If you can ignore my punch, I haven't stolen your time. If you have to react to this, either because you're seeing stars or because you don't want to see stars, then I can actually perform the necessary actions to get you to open your guard or to get you to create a dispositive, or even just to keep you addled and stuck in that broken OODA loop long enough for me to affect some other kind of change upon your body. Which brings me to a yunque, which is the anvil, and that's literally I'm using those hiras and those small gravitational acceleration movements to deliver power. And where possible, I try not to leave the círculo propio while I'm doing that. Again, because this being a self-defense system primarily, what I want is that if somebody's right up in your shit, like somebody's all over you, do you have the ability in that very, very small and confined space to then generate enough power to dissuade them from continuing the engagement? Which brings me to acometimiento, which it's not about first or second intention, it's about bad intentions. And I'll get to some of the definitions later, but if the opponent can safely ignore it, so you do not have medio proporcionado, or you do not commit, then it's false, because you create a moment of disposition for yourself, whereas your opponent remains ready and can act during your movement. If it is performed without atajo, it is false because it could generate a double kill, or at least get your nose thumped. And if you have atajo and medio proporcionado, take the shot. Is my feeling on this. In fact, it plays directly into how I structure a boxing match, certainly. And that is here where I say, like, when faced with an opponent with a good postura or guard that permits no easy disposición in which to strike, we must either counterpunch, lie in wait like good diestros, while they create a disposition in preparation to attack us, or they provide us with a movement in which to operate, right, during, or we can force, necesitar, them to open their guard or postura via acometimiento. And here I have two definitions, which Puck will certainly find familiar, but this is from Mary's translation of Compendio de la Filosofía y Destreza de las Armas de Jerónimo Carranza por Luis Pacheco de Narváez. And that is that necesitar al contrario es sacarlo de buena postura, que tiene que hacer que ponga en algún extremo. Que se ponga en algún extremo. To necessitate the adversary is to take him out of good positioning that he has and make him put himself in some extreme. And aviso, which is what I think is a feint proper. Aviso es una herida de primera intención que se ejecuta sin reparo ni acometimiento. Aviso is a strike of first intention that is executed without parry or acometimiento. So that right there to me is the feint as we understand it in the sense of a fake, whereas acometimiento I feel does have that meaning of it being a committed attack. Like it's real. If you don't do something about this, it's going to end you. It's just we feel it is obvious enough that you're probably going to do something about it. However, because we're good diestros and we have a discrete number of tretas which cover a high degree of uncertainty, I know what you're going to do in order to stop this. And that's where you have a limited number of responses you can have, and I have a response already for all of those responses. And that to me is the essence of what we're doing when we're talking about acometimiento. And that I believe is it. Oh, this is the use of force assessment that I include with a lot of my self-defense and defensive tactics training, and it's just a real simple algorithm which I think Pacheco would sorry, not Pacheco would hate this, Carranza would appreciate, and that's really that if I can solve this problem without violence, I'm going to solve it without violence. If I can solve it by getting the hell out of there, I'm going to solve it by getting the hell out of there. If force has become necessary, then having that scalable, adaptable degree of force to be able to say, okay, well, I don't need to, crack this guy's occipital or collapse his trachea to finish this conversation. And also the restraint to then stop when the threat is concluded, and not taking punitive action, and making sure that you go from being a perfect and pardon me for gendering this, a perfect gentleman, in the beginning, during, and after the engagement, by trying to make sure that everybody stays as safe as possible. And I think that's so that is what I've got. Stop sharing. So that's what I got. That is the project as it exists. I've got obviously some changes to make to the graphics, and I'm still trying to figure out ways to visually represent a lot of what I can explain in person spatially when I'm working with people. But that was my attempt at seeing if I understood enough of LVD to use it in a cogent and cohesive manner to a realm that it had not yet been applied to that I have seen. So I don't know how y'all feel about it, but I'm super eager to find out.
All right. So let's.
Shit! I've gone like way over time, haven't I?
A little bit, but let's. I think we can go ahead and unmute to ask questions. There's not very many of us here.
Ash, I have a question. Do you change lead? And if you do, how do you deal with inside, outside when it changes?
I teach not to change leads if possible, because again, I don't want to introduce too much complexity into the system for folks who perhaps don't have a lot of combative experiences. I personally do switch leads actually quite a bit. And I do that often as part of my offline movements. So if someone's occupying space and I'm yielding a section of space, I will sometimes not take that transversal quite as deep. And instead I will move, for example, if I'm left-hand lead and somebody's crashing my center, but they're coming in just slightly towards the left side, I will yield that left side, and then as I'm doing that, I'll use the rotational moment to extend a lead hand strike, like a jab, for example, up the new particular diameter that I've established, and usually that'll make contact as they're entering range, and then I'll fight from there for a little while until the opportunity presents itself to go back to my orthodox. I had actually started when I was first looking at stuff. A lot of Savat manuals have a right foot and right hand lead, and I had looked at a more bladed stance originally, but I found that it works very well within the context of something like Savat and some forms of kickboxing to have that bladed stance. But once you get into a more complicated martial scenario involving grappling and or multiple opponents, then it starts to fall down a little bit. So I decided to go with a more evenly balanced squared stance. And the orthodox left forward stance is more in keeping not only with the use of shield and sword and board, or shield and sword, which is a technique that we see more often. Again, we're seeing it in riots is really what I'm getting at, and it's also in keeping with modern weapon retention needs.
So I have a question.
Senor.
You are teaching this to students, is that right?
Yeah. The actual practical side of things. When I'm teaching the self-defense course, I'm not worried too much about teaching them the theory that went into the development. I'm just trying to get the skills in hands.
How is that going?
It actually went fairly well. I mean, I have moved and have as part of the move, I actually ended up selling most of my gym, so I'm eventually going to have to rebuild it. But it was good. I was seeing some real skills development in students, and again, it was enough that a couple of my students had started to go to the University of Calgary Sparring Club, which is a fantastic resource, and I think every town should have it. And actually starting to employ what they had learned, and as they got used to the idea of getting punched in the face as well, because most of them, like I said, had no real combative experience, and we're trying to get a little bit of experience under their belts. They were starting to really enjoy it and really feel good about what they had learned, and it was a simple enough system and relied on familiar and comfortable enough biomechanics that most of them were able to perform the skills necessary pretty readily.
So another question. It seems pretty unlikely to me that in the course of my life that I would get involved in a violent encounter with swords, which is what I spend most of my time training. But you're training this this unarmed discipline using Destreza concepts, and it seems to me much more likely that you would encounter real life situations. I'm just curious if you've run into any of these situations. You know, we live in turbulent times right now. Have you gotten it into a situation where these skills were necessary?
I haven't had to use this system since I started working it. I spent 7 years doing high-risk security and close protection in Calgary, and in the high-risk security section of the program, I was Calgary is interesting. We have our downtown core, all of the office tower, well, many of the office towers and many of the hotels and retail sections of the downtown are connected by a series of pedestrian footbridges, which are covered and insulated and heated. which is really nice for pedestrians. It creates a security nightmare in that it becomes a bit of a warren of hidey holes and switchbacks at night. And so I was supervising security and managing security for sites that were in excess of like 6 million square feet, spread out over multiple city blocks, with tens of thousands of people in them daily. And I spent most of my time performing arrests in like stairwells and concrete hallways and parkades, and often there was a component of like drug use or yeah, it was a rough bit of work. So something in the neighborhood of 75 arrests that required force, and I was also bouncing at the time. So a lot of the techniques that made it in are stuff that I have used to effect in the past, but again, I winnowed out a lot of the stuff that was that I found was extraneous, or that was just sort of like cool. I like Pucha Kapali, right? I've gotten to play with a couple of Salat guys, and like there's techniques that you're just not, you don't need to show somebody who's barely got any combat experience, right? It's just going to confuse them. It's just going to add to that Hicks law problem. So, yeah, most of the techniques at some point or another I have had to make use of, but not cohesively in a system like this. Since I started development of that, I had stopped working security by then, so I haven't been in a need to use it in earnest. But in the boxing ring, which, as I said, I'd adapted some of it for sparring, I have gotten to use it at the University of Calgary Boxing Club, University of Calgary Sparring Club, as well as in the boxing ring, sparring at the gym I was at, and during my so far only amateur bout that I got to participate in before COVID hit. So,
out of curiosity, since every style I've seen that uses lots of kicks has roundhouse kicks, since I didn't see them on the list, did you leave it off because it wasn't another HEMA traditions, or did it not work with the footwork of the style, or what was the process of editing that out?
It can be tossed in. Part of it is I find roundhouses require a little bit more athleticism to deliver properly and deliver in balance. So that was, again, it was less vital for me to include that, because I didn't have faith that everybody was going to be able to pick it up rapidly enough. But also round kicks, when improperly delivered, they create a fairly obvious dispositive. Like you have to train them for a long time in order to get them as crisp as you want to be able to snap them out without too much warning. So I definitely teach how to deal with them using the shazba and the straight kick, but it's not a technique that I found was useful for what I was trying to achieve with the system. I'm also not primarily trying to do damage with the strikes again, right? I'm using them either to range or to create opportunities for the grappling techniques which come later.
Ash, we had another question from the chat. You talked earlier about training proprioception and efficient movement. Do you have some recommendations for training people who still need to develop that kind of knowing where their body is in space? You talked about the drill in the doorway.
Yeah.
Is that your main one, or do you have some others?
That's my main one, actually. My real love affair with proprioception began at the Patty Crane workshop, where I was blessed to get to start the morning with Scotty Witt, who is a phenomenal fight choreographer, martial artist, and clown. From oh god, I'm gonna say Australia. He might be in New Zealand. Either way, he's gonna shiv me. But anyway, he's from Oceania, and he's One of the exercises that he started us doing was something as simple as close your eyes and find your joints, right? Find where you are in space, and make sure that you can go, fingers, elbows, shoulder, fingers, elbows, shoulder with your eyes closed. Go all the way up and down your body, change positions, figure out where you're at. Balance, stand still, and you'll see. I turned off the. There's a very small green, my línea, my transversales, my diámetro, and my línea infinita. I picked it out in like green painter's tape on the floor in that little apartment that I was in Milk River, and I would just sit in the center of that. And go through my hitas and just go through basic footwork to just make sure that I'm balanced and make sure that what I'm doing is natural to me. And then you start to play into those ideas of, okay, well, now I've stepped too far. What is the natural movement from here, right? What am I going to do that is going to readdress me towards that target really quickly? And then when I work, for example, with a heavy bag, I let the heavy bag swing rather than pinning it down at the bottom and keeping it rigid. I let the heavy bag swing as much as possible so that I can work all the way around it and start to make more dynamic use of those ranges and those attacks. But mostly for the proprioception it's literally like sit there and figure out where you are in space. When you're getting contact with another person, once COVID ends, or if you've got somebody who wants to play with you in your cohort, and close your eyes, grab each other by the shoulders, and then find each other's body parts. And have one partner say, okay, you can go for my elbow, go for my shoulder, go for my knee, go for my ankle, right? And learn to read where a human's body is based on what you can reach right now, right? If you've got two joints, you know where their next joint is. You know where the next 2 or 3 joints are probably. If I've got your wrist and your elbow, I can feel which direction your upper arm is headed in, so I know where that shoulder is. If I know where that shoulder is, I know what line it occupies where your neck is going to be. So I can reach any part of you, eyes closed, but it also helps me to learn how to read myself, because I'm adding the information from the schema I'm getting of your body to my positional schema, and I'm building a more adept body schema by manipulating another human body.
So one of the things when we're training this for a sword application, we can use the conceit that if the sword hits you in a meaningful way, it's probably going to do some X degree of debilitating damage. So getting hit is kind of the stopping point of a lot of sword training. With a unarmed self-defense application, getting hit obviously can't be the stopping point of that situation. So to what extent do you work with students to become comfortable with receiving blows and discomfort? And at a basic level, what does that look like?
At the basic level, it's partner drills that are of increasing antagonism, I guess, increasing resistance. I will. Oh, sorry, just got some news. All right. I will start them off learning the basic techniques, and then start on with some light sparring, some light combinations. Let both partners work on the combos. This is one of the problems with teaching self-defense in any scenario. Is part of the reason why you get folks who are like, well, man, I took Krav for like 4 years, but when I got hit that one time, at the actual bar, I didn't have a response. It's that our neural schema of what we're normally doing when we train, that is play, doesn't necessarily carry over to the emotional distress, etc., of a combative situation. Play is the best way to teach the skills, but as Rory Miller actually it goes into some depth about in his book, well, in several of his books, there's a threshold of where you can start to use what you learn in the situation proper, right? So he used the example of fighter pilots who have to be through 5 fights before they're considered an ace pilot. And what that means is that that's where they've actually stopped just running on blind instinct and panic, and have gotten to the point where they can use the tactical information that they've gained because they're no longer having that novelty adrenal response, that novel adrenal response rather, of being in a dogfight. And he says in one of his books that, you know, if you're in a if you live a life where, you know, you've gotten past that threshold with like arrest and detention tactics, then you're probably in law enforcement or something like that. And if you're at the point where you can do that with self-defense tactics and in self-defense scenarios, then you need to re-examine some of the things that have happened in your life, or some of the choices you're making. And that is, for me, one of the biggest difficulties in transmission, because I was exposed to a lot of violence in my youth, and so I crossed that threshold against my will very early on. And so, and Ken can vouch for this. He's actually one of the ones who's made this observation of me, is you can pretty much just feed a tactic into my head, and I will use it in my next fight. I can read or have something explained to me, and I will be able to deploy it in my next fight, because it's really difficult to get me into a full adrenal response because trauma. And since that's not something I want to build in other people, though, I'm looking at, well, I'm reading through for the second time now, Kaya Sadowski's book, Fear is the Mind Killer, specifically to be able to find better ways to pass that on without leaning on the classical martial arts pedagogy of, okay, cool, now you know a bunch of tactics, now go get thumped, until you like it. So I am not the authority on the subject of getting people there, but would any of my students be ready in a full-on assault? I certainly hope so, but again, the emotional stress of being in the actual moment, it could just revert someone to their original conditioning, right? Which is often to freeze or to fly or to fawn, instead of to fight. And but that's something that I won't be able to address until they're in that moment, or until I've gotten better tools than what is typically available in martial arts pedagogy for the development of self-defense neural response.
Thanks for that, Ash. We have gone well past time, but I think everybody has been pretty engaged with the subject, and I really appreciate you helping us close out the year with this presentation. They're really interesting. We are going to be off for 2 weeks, and then we will see where we land. I don't expect us to be able to open the schools until summer, so we'll just keep figuring out what we can do to keep this series going over that time. We had originally thought we were going to be doing this for maybe 3 months, and this is month number 9. But every challenge, every crisis has opportunity, and I think we've used this year to help reach out and build a more global community. So thanks to everyone who's been part of it, and thank you so much, Ash, for sharing your time and your expertise. And
thank you guys for setting this up, and thank you guys for everything that you've done, not only over the course of this year, obviously, but for the style and everything that you continue to do, all of you, translating and and interpreting and doing the work that my ADHD has so much trouble with. But we have a beautiful community, and we're building something great, and I'm really, really excited. Oh, and I said I was going to flog my idea of a concordance. Let's get a concordance together, guys. Like, if we can get all the definitions from all the different manuals in one place where we can compare and contrast them side by side, I think we would find that to be of great value. But that's a big fence to paint. So I'm trying to get my Tom Sawyer on.
There's a way to do that, and it's not terribly difficult. We could do it via Airtable, which is a free organizing type resource, but it's not good at holding a lot of data. It's good at holding a lot of scheduling, not a lot of data. We could potentially set up a wiki.
That'd be great.
And to put up a wiki, learning the back end can be a bit of a pain. It's basically learning wiki markup language. But once you do that and you give people who are interested the opportunity to go in and do the editing, well, what you do is you first look up your term, and if the term's not entered yet, you create a page for that term. And then you put in where you've seen the term and which book it is. And we'll possibly create tags or links to separate documents. And then once that happens, like let's say you find the word aviso, and you put in the word aviso as you've seen it appear in the works that you've seen. And I come across it. So I go onto the Wikipedia, onto the Destrezapedia or whatever, and I type up aviso, and your page comes up. I'm like, okay, we already have some material on this, so now I'll go in and I'll add the stuff that I've found. And that way you can cross-link entries, like we might say, sí, acometimiento, or stuff like that. And anytime in the text, like if you pull the sentence or the fraction of a sentence that word might show up in, if there's other Destreza key terms, well, you turn those into links. So somebody can be like, oh, propio, click. Off you go to the propio page. Considering we just talked about this a lot, that means I've pretty much volunteered to do this, haven't I?
Only if you've got the emotional and mental juice for it, because I know that some of us have trouble with stretching ourselves thin.
Yeah. We'll see how I go. I'll keep people posted on the Discord, since people seem to be checking out the Discord fairly frequently.
We had a Destreza wiki at destreza.us, but keeping it up to date was tough. So it's still there, but I need to get in and salvage it by updating the software. For the website.
Yeah, that's one of the biggest pains is making sure that your software is updated. And I don't know enough to be confident to be like, no, I got to go fix my SQL database, and this is how I do it. No.
Yeah, pretty much the same thing. At some point, it's one of those things I avoid because I don't want to do it, and I really should fix it. So
now,
we could edit.
What we can do is I can do a little research on externally hosted wikis. Because I think
I did that. We have a Confluence wiki, but once you get over 10 users, it's expensive.
Okay. Because I've got my StoryTrade server, which is not the most stable server because my service provider's been doing funny things. But I can always just do another partition and put together a concordance. Like we can call it Destreza concordance or something like that.
Yeah, that would be lovely.
I just think it would be a really, really useful tool for interpretation as well as translation. So that'd be really cool.
Well, it could be good for all of us to be on the same page for a word too.
Right? Yeah. Oh, and be able to pull up all of our sources side by side and say, okay, so like this is where I'm coming at it from. Like, in what way is this? Does this vary?
Yeah.
So, I'm going to have to let you all go, though. I have to work in the not too distant because I'm working midnight tonight, and I still need to spend some time with my wife and also go to the bathroom in a really bad way. So I love you all. Thank you guys so much. This was a really good experience. I had a lot of fun, and I hope it was informative, and I hope it was Destreza.
Yep. Great stuff, Ash. Thank you so much.
Thanks, it's good to see you again.
Everybody, do your best to stay safe as we get through this, and we will see you next year.
Yes, please. Happy holidays to all of you.
Good night.
Love you
Quick
all,
thought
guys.
on the concordance one.
Mm.
How many of the texts do we have in electronic format on the Spanish side? Because maybe being able to do a Control F through text and finding all of the references that way. I did that
Two problems.
with
Two
okay.
problems with that. Number one, some of them are not OCR scans. They're just image scans, so you can't do a text search. Number two, some of the OCR scans that were done on those documents are very, very poor. So you'll highlight the word acometimiento, and then you'll copy that and you'll paste it into Notepad, and it comes up in Cyrillic. So there are some books that you can do it with, but
Yeah,
it's worth a shot.
optical character misrecognition is a thing.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't sure if maybe Manuela and them had it had copies that they used for what they were doing for their publishing. If a lot of them had electronic copy versions for the publishing purpose that we could do Control Fs off of.
Yeah. But it's worth doing it for the books that actually can support it. It's absolutely worth doing. I'll take a look through what I've got and see which ones qualify. I'll put a channel together for concordance on Discord, and then we'll coordinate there.